I'm going to assume everybody can hear me. We're going to talk a little bit about non-towered airport operations tonight. This is actually a repeat, a golden oldie, a goldie moldy, if you will, from about 2.5 years ago. Jeremy was kind enough to ask me to do one of his earlier breaking the chain segments, and boy, it's just grown exponentially since then. But this is a pretty good one, and I thought, well, let's do this one again because I think everybody can use the refreshment on it. And the next time, I think when we get together, we're going to talk about airspace and some other goodies. At any rate, so non-towered airport operations tonight. Here we go. So everything that we're doing tonight, just so that you know I'm not making this stuff up, everything comes from AIM Chapter 4-3-3, the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 14, the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 7, and Advisory Circular 90-66B, which you may not be familiar with. So I'm not making any of this stuff up. Everything that we talk about tonight can be found in one or more of the publications that are there on the screen. So I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important to have a good understanding of operating in a non-towered environment. If you look at the screen here, I mean, those are 5 or 6 bullet points right there tell it all. Most mid-air collisions happen in good weather during the daylight within 5 miles of a non-towered field at basically traffic pattern altitude, with both airplanes flying in the same direction. And folks, it can happen. It really can happen to anyone, regardless of experience. I don't know if you remember, about 3 years ago now, I guess it's been about 3 years ago, there was a mid-air collision at Aero Country, which is a mixed-use private airport on the east side of Dallas. It's a residential/business type air park there. And there was an Arrow that was coming in from the northwest, across the field, kind of kitty corner, and took off the tail section of a Luscombe that was in the traffic pattern, just doing circuits, and killed all the occupants. It landed in a heap of metal in I think it was a Home Depot parking lot. Everybody died, and it was either on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. I forget, the details are a little bit foggy at this point, but and unfortunately though, the NTSB is full of reports like that, where someone has entered the traffic pattern or not paying attention or what have you, and it ends up on the evening news. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about who has the right of way. If you look at 91.113, this is what it tells you. It tells you converging, the least maneuverable has the right of way. If you're head on, it's altering to the right. If you're being overtaken, the faster airplane passes to the right, and landing traffic on final approach are lower of the two if both are on final. But there's also a caveat there. The regs say that the lower aircraft, and this is a quote, shall not take advantage of this rule to cut in front of another which is on final approach to land or to overtake that aircraft. So in other words, just because you might be lower, it doesn't necessarily give you the right to cut somebody else off to get to the runway. So those are some things to keep in mind as we go through the next few slides. Today's mission is going to be a $100 hamburger. Well, with gas prices, maybe it's closer to $200 now. We're going to fly from West Houston Airport, which is a non-towered field, straight line up to Lufkin, Angelina County, which is another non-towered field. So we're departing a non-towered field, heading towards a non-towered field. So let's talk a little bit about good practices leaving that non-towered field. Lineup and wait, as you know, is the current phraseology for what used to be called position and hold. A taxi to position and hold has been replaced by lineup and wait. That's a monumentally bad idea at a non-towered field, and here's the reason why. This actually happened up in Dallas at the Northwest Regional Airport several years ago. I know that's the case because I was doing a rusty pilot seminar up in Dallas several years ago, and I showed this picture in conjunction with the kind of things we're talking about right now. And the guy raised his hand, and the guy had some courage. He actually raised his hand in front of about 75 people and said, I was in one of those two airplanes. I didn't have the heart to ask him which one he was in, but he was in one of those two airplanes. And there was simply a situation there where a lack of communication resulted in what could have been a real tragedy. Nobody was killed in that. I don't recall if there were any injuries to anything other than metal and fabric. But either way, the insurance company wasn't happy. So line up and wait at a non-tower field, a monumentally bad idea. And it's usually because someone is just impatient and doesn't want to wait his or her turn. As we're leaving a non-towered field, and we announced that on the Unicom or the CTAF, the recommended departure is straight out or straight out to 1,000 feet, and then make your turn to the left in the event that it's a left-hand traffic pattern. If you're staying in the circuit to do takeoffs and landings, then you're going to make that crosswind turn within 300 feet of traffic pattern altitude. Otherwise, and that's if you're remaining in the pattern, otherwise you're going to climb out to 1,000 feet, then make your 45-degree turn to the left in the case of a left-hand traffic pattern. Now, oftentimes I get asked, well, what if I want to turn the other direction? If taking off out of West Houston Airport, which is my home airport, if I want to go and take advantage of a $100 hamburger up in Brenham, well, that's a right-hand turn out of the traffic pattern, and it's a left-hand traffic pattern. So I have tried to find guidance on that specific situation, and I can't find any. So about the best that I can suggest to folks from a common sense standpoint is if you want to exit the traffic pattern opposite the direction of the traffic pattern, go ahead and climb straight out to 1,000 feet, and just assuming airspace allows you to do so, keep on flying as you climb. And when you're a safe distance from the airport, and I realize that's somewhat subjective, but when you're at a safe distance from the airport, go ahead and make that right-hand turn out to wherever it is you want to go. Some folks like to turn crosswind within 300 feet of the traffic pattern, and then turn downwind, and then make another left-hand turn and exit the pattern across the midfield. That certainly is another way to do it. If you're able to climb high enough so that you're clear of the traffic pattern altitude-wise, as you make that turn across the runway, then it's probably perfectly safe to do. But what I have seen happen in the past is people level off at traffic pattern altitude, and then they turn and they cross the runway at midfield, and it puts them at traffic pattern altitude or slightly above on the upwind side of the airport. And even though it's not recognized as a part of the traffic pattern, there are people coming in from the other side of the field that will enter a left upwind for the airport, and then fly a crosswind, downwind, base, and final. So again, at a non-tower field, there's a lot of common sense that has to happen, even though we do have specific guidance. Now, this is just one of my little personal pet peeves, and I know that Jeremy is laughing right now because he teases me about this all the time, as do most of my pilot friends at West Houston. One of my personal pet peeves in terms of traffic pattern work in a non-towered field, or leaving the traffic pattern particularly, is last call. That seems to have raised its ugly head over the last few years, and I'm hearing it more and more and more, and I don't know why. I really and truly don't. It's not in any of the pilot controller glossary versions that you can find anywhere. It's not in any text that I can find anywhere, any written text in any pilot manual or handbook or anything. It's certainly not in AIM. And why? No one cares if it's your last call. I have asked a couple of people, as I've done, I don't know, hundreds of check rides over the last couple of years. Invariably, I get somebody that will say this, leaving a non-tower field, and it's always a part of the debrief. And the question is basically, as I noticed you said last call, you know, just out of curiosity, why did you say that? And the answers that I get are the kind of variations on the theme, but here's the general gist of it. Well, I just want folks to know that I'm leaving the traffic pattern, and if they need to get in touch with me, this is the last chance to do it. Well, when I get an answer like that, my first question is, okay, I understand. Well, when was the last time somebody said, oh, hey, 42 Juliet, before you go? And every one of them has kind of sheepishly looked at me and said, well, never. So my question is, what in the world is good about last call? Not a thing. It doesn't add anything to enhance safety. But on the contrary, actually what it implies is I'm out of here and I'm not looking out for you anymore. You guys are on your own. I'm gone. I've talked to some of my fellow DPEs, and they are kind of the same opinion that I am, is that really just implies that whoever said it isn't looking anymore. And boy, it's putting the onus on the rest of us to watch out for that person. So I would respectfully suggest that if you're one of the folks that says last call, that you reconsider doing that. It really doesn't add anything at all to the conversation. So we're going up to Angelina County, Lufkin, and these are some very basic questions. Is it a towered airport? Yes. And actually, no, it isn't, because it's a magenta colored airport symbol. So is it a towered airport? No, it's a magenta colored airport symbol. If it was a towered field, it would be all together now. I can hear you. Blue, you're right. If we want to know what the weather is, we can look at listen to the AWOS, or the ASOS in this case, at 120.625. Next question is the traffic left hand or right hand? If you look at the airport data block there, where it gives you the airport elevation and all that other stuff, down at the very bottom there, if it was right hand traffic, it would say RP with the runway number or numbers that would be affected by that right-hand traffic pattern. And remember, all traffic is to the left unless otherwise specified. So this is left-hand traffic. It's not otherwise specified as right-hand traffic. We're going to listen to the AWOS, in this case, the ASOS, I should say. And as we do that, we're going to listen, and we're going to hear that the wind is 120 at 9, 2,900 scattered, and the altimeter is 30.02. Lufkin traffic pattern altitude is 1,000 feet AGL unless otherwise published, and it would be in the chart supplement if it were going to be otherwise than that. So we have a 1,000-foot traffic pattern altitude, AGL. So if you add 296 feet, which is the airport elevation, to 1,000 feet, you get 1,296 feet, which we're going to round up and call it 1,300 feet. So, and by the way, that wind that you're hearing on the ASOS is magnetic. If you read it, it's true. If you hear it, it's magnetic. And why is it magnetic? Because the runways are lined up with magnetic headings. So the powers that be don't want us to have to do any arithmetic. And it's not that big a deal down here in Texas and sort of in the central part of the country. But if you're out in the Pacific Northwest, where you have a 16-degree easterly variation, that means you got to do some arithmetic. And on my best day, I don't tend to do arithmetic very well in my head. So that's the reason it is magnetic, so you don't have to do any ciphering in your head. So let's talk a little bit about the runway here now. Just coincidentally, that wind happens to be today from 120 degrees, which is right smack dab in the middle of those two runways that we have to choose from in Lufkin. And folks, this is not that far-fetched a situation. When San Marcos, which has a similar runway configuration, was a non-towered field. When New Braunfels was a non-towered field. Down in South Texas, we have Palacios, a non-towered field, have 2 or 3 runways, 2 of which are configured more or less like you see here. And when the wind is coming kind of halfway in between the two, well, which one do you choose? So we've got a choice of runway 16 or runway 7. We could, I suppose, we could just do a right base to runway 7, or since if you look at the airplane in the very lower part of the screen there, that's where we're coming from. So I suppose we could enter a right downwind for runway 16, or just enter a right base for runway 17. But wait a minute, remember, all turns, well, all the traffic pattern is always to the left unless otherwise specified. So it's not otherwise specified, but it's more than just that. If you look at 91.126, it tells you all turns shall be made to the left. So if we, if I said 127, I'm sorry, 91.126 says that all turns are to be made to the left. So even though a right downwind to 1.6 or a right base to 7 is the quickest and most expeditious way to do it, we're actually in violation of a reg if we do so. So that's not going to be a very good choice for us. So let's talk a little bit about the way these various publications that I mentioned earlier talk about entering a non-towered traffic pattern. All of us have seen this in one form or another, usually in AIM 4-3-3 is where you're going to see that. You'll also see it in the 90-66B advisory circular. And the 45-degree entry at midfield at traffic pattern altitude is always recommended as best practice. But you'll remember from the previous slide that we're coming in from kind of the wrong side of the field, if you will, to enter into a left-hand traffic pattern on the downwind leg. So here would be another option, and this is in Chapter 7 of the Airplane Flying Handbook. It says if the traffic pattern is not busy, just join in midfield downwind, just like it says, at traffic pattern altitude, giving way to any aircraft on the preferred 45-degree entry, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate way to enter the traffic pattern at a non-tower field, at traffic pattern altitude, giving way to any traffic that may be coming in the other direction. This one is also in Chapter 7 of the Airplane Flying Handbook, and I have to tell you, I'm not a big fan of this one, primarily because so oftentimes it's done incorrectly. When it's done incorrectly, folks, I would suggest to you that this is probably the most dangerous way to enter a traffic pattern. Now, let's dissect this kind of segment by segment. First of all, it says overfly the field 500 feet above the highest pattern. The highest pattern at a non-towered field is 1,500 feet. Typically, that's where you'll find your twins and your turbines at 1,500 feet. So if you're going to do this, you should overfly the field at 2,000 feet AGL. 2,000 feet AGL. Now, it also goes on to say, go past the airport 2 miles past the downwind leg. Well, that's all, and then start your descending turn. Don't start descending before that, but start your descending turn back to traffic pattern altitude. Well, here's the problem, or a potential problem here, is how far out do most people fly that downwind leg? And I would suggest to you that it varies. If you're flying some low and slow J3 Cub, you're probably at about 500 or 600 feet, and you're probably flying, who knows, a quarter mile or something from the runway. I don't know, but you're going to be really, really close, because that's how those little airplanes fly. They just like to fly low and slow and close to the runway. If you're flying a Cirrus or a Comanche or some faster single, you might prefer to fly a wider traffic pattern. You might be a mile and a half. So I have seen some 747 style traffic patterns at West Houston Airport, even with Cessna 172. So you can't say with any confidence how wide the downwind leg is, but this is saying to fly 2 miles beyond that. So you're having to fly 2 miles beyond a distance that you don't even really know where it starts. My recommendation is typically, if you're going to do something like this, cross the field at 500 feet above the highest traffic pattern altitude and start measuring your distance from the runway itself, from the dotted line, and go out 3 miles, maybe 3.5 miles, maybe even 4, depending on how busy the traffic pattern is. The danger in this particular way of entering the traffic pattern is when you do it incorrectly. And among other things, I have seen people cross midfield at traffic pattern altitude, And I've seen them start their turn back to the field pretty much about right where the downwind leg is, or maybe just a little bit beyond the downwind leg. And of course, again, somebody flying a wide downwind, it puts both of those airplanes in potentially direct conflict with one another. I've also seen people fly such a large radius turn back to the airport that it darn near puts them on the crosswind leg in a conflicting position, in a potentially head-on conflicting type position on the crosswind leg. So I've actually had 2 near misses with people who are coming in from the wrong side of the field. I use wrong side in quotation marks, and entering the traffic pattern this direction when I've been coming in from the other side of the field, entering at a 45-degree to the downwind leg. So I have some pretty strong opinions about this from a self-preservation standpoint, and just bad experiences that I've had, but I'll stand by them because, and with the caveat that if this is done correctly, it's a perfectly safe maneuver. If it's done incorrectly, it's potentially the most dangerous way that you can enter the traffic pattern. So enough of that rant. Let's go on to the next one, a straight-in approach. So it's interesting that 90-66B, the advisory circular that we referred to earlier, says that straight ins are not considered a part of the traffic pattern. But hey, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to fly a traffic pattern in a non-towered field? Well, maybe not necessarily. What if you're flying a practice instrument approach? By definition, that is usually going to be a straight-in approach. So, and folks, we have to practice this stuff, especially if we're instrument rated or we're training for instruments, for an instrument check ride. We have to practice this stuff, and we're going to be practicing it at a non-towered field. From time to time, at least anyway. So if you're going to do a straight in, either on an instrument, a practice instrument approach, or just because you're too lazy to fly a regular traffic pattern, at least make some good, concise, precise radio calls on your way in. And one of the things that I have found helpful, because I fly straight in approaches too when I'm practicing an instrument approach, or I'm doing a check ride and we're doing an instrument approach into a non-towered field. I just add the words, I'll give my position and I'll say straight in, full stop, traffic permitting. And I use those last 2 words simply to indicate to folks that I don't expect them to extend their downwind 14 miles just so that I can come in and not have to fly a traffic pattern. And my experience has been that if I say something like that, which takes very little effort, it's a courtesy. And I've yet to have someone not volunteer to extend the downwind leg so that we can come in for that approach. It's usually West Houston traffic. Cessna 713 Sierra Mike is 6 miles north inbound on the RNAV 15, straight in, full stop, traffic permitting, or straight in, low approach, traffic permitting. Just the addition of those 2 words can make all the difference in the world in the attitude of somebody that's in the traffic pattern, who you're upsetting because that person is flying a straight in just because they can. Actually, case in point, I was doing a check ride today, and there were 2 airplanes in the traffic pattern, and one on a 10-mile final on a practice approach, and announcing accordingly. And a Malibu, which was faster than all of us, calls in on 4 miles to the north of the field, reporting a straight in. And a couple of, and he also, I was also doing some other stuff that just was uncalled for. But anyway, the airplane on a 10-mile final reported again where she was, and we had another airplane getting ready to turn base, and this guy just came busting into the traffic pattern. The downwind airplane had to extend. we're on a check ride. We're I guess it would be number 4 in the traffic pattern at this time. And of course, my applicant is nervous enough on a check ride, and now she's got to deal with with this bogey that came in, and everything else that was happening in the traffic pattern. Now she handled it fine, but the point is that that this guy's his impatience really did create some problems, to the point when we turned final. We were 3 miles from the airport when we turned final, just because this Yahoo decides he doesn't want to fly a normal traffic pattern and fit in with the rest of us. So again, straight ins are fine and dandy, but just make sure that you're not interfering with other traffic, and just try to fit in, and let folks know that you're willing to give way if you're going to be causing some problems. I hope that makes sense. So we're kind of back to what runway we use, and at the end of the day, it really can be either one. If there's no traffic in the pattern whatsoever, flip a coin. It really doesn't matter. Otherwise, be listening to CTAF and just fall in with whatever the rest of the folks in the traffic pattern are doing. You can also call the Unicom, and it could be something like Angelina County Unicom. Skyhawk 12345 is 8 miles south inbound landing. Do you have a preferred runway? Now, if you have a Unicom operator that doesn't answer, that's one thing. But oftentimes somebody will be on Unicom, or perhaps there'll be another airplane in the pattern that would be willing to give you a PIREP on what runway is in use. So at this point, really either one can be used. So how would we enter this traffic pattern? Let's just say we chose to enter, use runway 7. Well, as we talked about from the previous slide, we could either at traffic pattern altitude 1,300 feet, fly kind of parallel to runway 1634 and enter the cross runway 7 and 25 and enter a left downwind there kind of on the north side of the field. We could conceivably do this, kind of cross, let's say cross runway 1634 and enter a left downwind for runway 16. Really, any of those work. And of course, the old teardrop entry to the downwind could also work if you crossed over the runway 17 at what would that be? I guess it would be at 2,300 feet or so, and then you make your turn back in. The same thing on runway 1634. So there's a number of choices that you've got, all of them perfectly good, perfectly legitimate, and no reason that they shouldn't be safe if they're done properly. So those would be my recommendations. And again, now if there's a lot of planes in the traffic pattern, you may have to use some common sense and just figure out what is going to be the safest way for me to do that. Keeping in mind that all turns have to be made to the left, and obviously we don't want to trade paint with anybody. So at some point, a good healthy dose of common sense comes into play there. So I hope that helps. Some of the keys to successes: proper radio calls. Well, I'll tell you what, tune in and verify radio frequencies. More than one time in my career, I hate to admit, I have tuned into the wrong frequency and wondered why nobody's talking. When you do tune into the frequency, once you've made sure, or assuming that you made sure that it's the right one, listen for a few seconds and make sure that somebody isn't already making a report and that you're just not stepping all over them. Speaking clearly is important. The young person that I did the check ride for today, her radio calls were excellent. Her radio work was excellent, but she was talking like she got paid by the word. And so during the debrief, I complimented on her radio work, but just said, slow down just a little bit. Make sure that people can understand what it is you're saying, because a radio call doesn't mean anything if the person that's making the radio call can't be understood. And now you've got a bunch of people, especially if they want to be snarky about it, calling up and, saying they couldn't understand the word you said. I've heard that happen too. And then of course, now you get a bunch of arguments happening over the radio, which isn't good. Be concise, be accurate, be gone. In other words, say what you need to say, then shut up and listen. And when it comes time for the next radio call, again, say what you need to say, then shut up and listen. Be concise, be accurate, be gone. And again, in large caps there, listen, listen, listen. Try not to engage in chit chat with other airplanes. There's a frequency for that, and contrary to popular belief, it's not 123.45 or fingers, as some people call it. It's 122.75. The air-to-air frequency is 122.75. And that's the frequency that ought to be used if you're going to do air-to-air chit-chat and things like that. You also don't need to announce every move while taxiing. I'm taxiing over to the fuel farm to get some gas. Well, I'm done getting my gas. I'm going to taxi out to the active, that kind of stuff is just not really necessary. See and be seen. Turn on the lights. Light that airplane up. It doesn't cost you anything to turn on the landing lights and the strobes and anything else that you think you might need in order to be seen. And again, remember, VFR conditions, it's a see and be seen kind of a thing. So talking about proper radio calls, if you're staying in the traffic pattern or if you're departing, this is another one of my pet peeves, taking the active. And usually when I'm doing a rusty pilot seminar, I'll say, well, you're taking the active, where are you taking it? When are you going to bring it back? I'm going to need it in a few minutes. I think it would be better to say I'm departing or I'm taking off runway, let's just say 15, for example. And going back to that Lufkin example, where we have two different runways where either one of those runways could be the runway in use. And by the way, there's no such thing as an active runway to non-towered field. It's the runway in use. Advisory Circular 90-66B says so. If you say taking the active, and everybody does it, most everybody anyway, especially at a field like Lufkin, it's not really telling anybody anything, especially people that are coming into land. If you say taking the active and you've got the choice between runway 7 and runway 16, because the wind is as it was today at 120, saying taking the active doesn't tell anybody anything. It would be better to say I'm departing runway 7 or I'm departing runway 16. If you're clearing the runway, I am clearing runway 16. I'm clearing runway 7. If you feel the need to make that announcement, so that's the rationale behind why taking the active is really not the clearest way that you can communicate what your activities are. Proper radio calls. If you're staying in the traffic pattern in particular, I would recommend and suggest to you, as does most of the literature, report your position as turning crosswind, turning downwind, turning base, and or turning final. The reason for that is that if you report when you're doing it, you're most visible to other people because your wings are not parallel to the ground anymore. They're in a bank, so you're going to be easily visible to people on the ground and other airplanes in the traffic pattern or coming in. And if you say turning and you're doing it at the corners, then instinctively people more or less know where to look for you. Oftentimes I'll hear people doing takeoffs and landings at a field, flying the upwind leg, and when they turn crosswind, they say, I'm entering crosswind. When they turn downwind, they say, I'm entering downwind. When they turn base, I'm entering base. When they turn final, I'm entering final. Okay, I get that, but at the same time, especially if you say entering downwind, well, my first thought is going to be look around midfield. So again, it's not against the law to say entering these particular legs, but it's certainly not the best radio communications to clearly communicate where it is you are and what it is that you're doing. Speaking of that, I'm orient inbound on the RNAV runway 15. If I'm not instrument rated, and even if I'm not based at that particular airport, wherever orient is, and it happens to be the final approach fix at West Houston on runway 15, if I'm not instrument rated or I'm not for the area and I don't know where that is, this has told me absolutely nothing. be far better off to say West Houston traffic, Skyline 713 Sierra Mike is 4 miles north inbound on the practice approach to runway 15. Because most of the time, your final approach fix is between 4 and 5 miles from the threshold of the runway. Most of the time, there are certain exceptions, but most of the time, that's where you're going to be. So why not say 4 miles north or 5 miles north instead of orange? That way, there's no misunderstanding as to where you are. I'm over the Cheese Whiz factory. This is from our Rusty Pilot course. Where's the Cheese Whiz factory? If I don't live wherever it is that Cheese Whiz factory is located, I'm not going to know where that thing is. So again, from a local knowledge standpoint, there's nothing wrong with that, but your audience is not always going to be local pilots. There are plenty of people that are going to be coming in to land at your airport that aren't from there. So be cognizant of that and be careful. Again, be concise, be accurate. We're 2 miles east is a little vague, but at the same time, with the GPS, we can get down to the 10th of a mile. And in this case, I'm on a pi mile final. So it doesn't need to be that precise. If you can tell the difference between 3.1 and 3.2 miles when you're scanning for traffic, boy, good on you. You must be Bob Hoover and Chuck Yeager all combined. So, okay, West Houston traffic, Cessna 713 Sierra Mike, we're about 3 miles to the north inbound landing. That's plenty accurate enough. It gives people the general idea of where to look. Some more personal pet peeves, Jeremy. I know you've been waiting for this one. Starting every call with "and" is one. I can't tell you how many times I hear people making an initial call to approach or something like that, and they'll start out with, "And Houston approach, this is Skyline 713 Sierra Mike," et cetera, et cetera. So with you, it's a useless use of airways. And by the way, ATC probably doesn't really care about the "with you" thing. I've actually heard some ATC folks say that it drives them up a wall, and I've heard some ATC folks say, "I don't really care." So there's no real consensus there. But folks, they know that you're with them by the fact that you call them up. So again, that's just a piece of airspace or airway frequency bandwidth that somebody else could be using. And on a really, really busy day, if everybody's saying "with you," it's just that much less time somebody else has a chance to get a word in edgewise. So personal opinion, do what you wish. Here's another one. There's no such thing as left final or right final for that matter. There's left downwind, left base. There's right crosswind, right downwind, right base, but there's no such thing as a right or left final. There could be, I'm on final approach to runway 6 left, but that's in the case where you have parallel runways. And here, drum roll, I'm saving the best for last. Any traffic in the area, please advise. And I know Jeremy is laughing his butt off right now because we were chuckling about this earlier. This is probably my #1 pet peeve. And it actually is that of a number of others, including all of the examiners I have ever talked to. If you look at AIM 4-1-9, and I believe it's paragraph G, if memory serves. I can see several of you scrambling for your AIM right now. 4-1-9 is clear. It basically says that particular radio call is an improper radio call and should not be used under any circumstances. It's the only phraseology that AIM calls out specifically as improper and should never be used. The only phraseology that AIM calls out specifically. I tell the story in our Rusty Pilot seminars. This is a true story. I was flying, taking off out of Brenham after a $100 hamburger a few years ago, and I hear this radio call, and I'm not making this up. Brenham traffic phenom 12345. I'm 10 miles north inbound on the RNAV 16 Brenham. Any traffic in the area, known or unknown, please advise. And I got to tell you, folks, I had to bite my tongue. I'm supposed to be a professional flight instructor, but boy, that was all I could do not to say something to that guy. But that gives a lot of laughs every time I tell it live. So, but that's an absolutely true story. I've not heard it since, but anyway, that's enough about that. All right, when we land at Angelina County or back at West Houston, as the case may be, we certainly want to remember to close our flight plan or to dump flight following, either or. If we want to get rid of flight following, we simply tell them that we have the airport in sight, and they'll tell us radar service terminated, squawk VFR frequency change approved. They might ask you to report the airport in sight, and once you do, they'll say the same thing. They'll say radar service terminated, squawk VFR frequency change approved. And if you had a flight plan on file and you opened it up with flight service, then you can close it on the remote communications outlet frequency. And it looks like I inadvertently cut it off on this graphic here, but there is an RCO, a remote communications outlet frequency at Angelina County. I'm confusing that with another graphic. Sorry about that. If there is a remote communications outlet in the vicinity of this airport, you could certainly do it that way, or you could call flight service. You can use the phone at the FBO. There might even be a dinosaur on the field. I think they still call them pay phones. They might still work if you got a quarter or a dime. Call it, here's a quarter, call someone who cares. At any rate, so those are the things that you can do as you're closing out your trip into that particular airport. Close the flight plan, and obviously you'll tell flight service, you'll tell flight following that you're done with them if they don't tell you first. So we're really just about to wrap it up here. This is kind of short and sweet. Plenty of time for conversation, questions and answers, and things like that. Again, I want to assure you that I didn't make any of this stuff up. AIM Chapter 4-3-3 has a lot of good information in it. Much of that same information can be found in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, or the PHAK, some people call it, Chapter 14. The Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 7, is where a lot of that stuff came from, where we talked about crossing midfield and joining the downwind or doing the teardrop entry. And of course, AC 90-66B, which has a lot of really, really good information in it. And it's not very long, folks. It's really only a few pages long, and it's well worth printing that out and reading it. It's got some really, really good information. So before I wrap up this few minutes of, really it's only been about 20 minutes here. Take a look at this. Is this a towered or a non-towered field? And if so, what kind of airspace is it? Believe it or not, this is a Class G airport. It's a towered field in Class G airspace. Interesting, very rare. And in fact, since this particular image was taken, that airport has since become a Class Delta airport. But the regs are very simple. If you look at 91-120, I think it's 127, but it's somewhere around that range there. It will address how you deal with a towered field in Class G airspace. Basically, you have to treat it as if it were a Class Delta airport. So within 4 nautical miles and up to 2,500 feet AGL, you have to be in contact with the tower before you can enter into their airspace, which again, according to that reg, is 4 nautical miles and 2,500 feet. So this airspace is in Class G airspace, and it's a towered field. So you again, it's very rare. You won't see them very often because most of the time they will become a Class Delta airport perhaps in the next chart cycle, but they're there. So look out and watch out for them. So that's really about it. That's all I've got. This is a fairly short and sweet thing. Let me see if I can open my camera up here and see if you can see me there. I guess you can. And let's see here. So let me go ahead and just get rid of the presentation and stop
if you need help
sharing.
with that, I can. There we go.
There we go.
Excellent, Pat.
So that was short and sweet and to the point, and so we got plenty of time to chat and argue if you want.
So if you have any
argue
questions,
about whether we should say any traffic in the area, please advise or not.
any questions in the seminar, please advise.
Yeah, there you go. I like that. I was waiting for one of you to say that.
One of the things that I was going to dovetail off of that one question is what airspace is around that particular airport. The very next question, when you ask that question, I always tell my students, if an examiner ever asks you what airspace is that right there, you need to ask that examiner a question in return. And that question is what altitude? Because we've got to think three-dimensional when it comes to airspace.
Exactly.
Pat,
and one of the things that
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. I probably neglected to mention that the airspace around Angelina County is class Echo to the surface. So it's a class G, it's a class, in this case, it's a class Echo airport, whereas the West Houston Airport is a class G airport that lies in class G airspace, which goes up to 700 feet, and then class Echo starts.
Temple is like that if you ever look at it. And I don't have it up in front of me right now, but if you look at Temple on the sectional, it's class Echo all the way to the surface. And yeah, one of the reasons why that is because it's got the ILS for 1.6. They just changed the runway alignments around here, as I'm sure you're well aware. But we have all of these private airstrips around the area. So obviously they've got to bring the VFR restrictions down closer to the surface to keep that IFR separation and everything. Right. Pat, I'm going to ask you, where did you learn to fly at a non-towered airport or at a towered airport?
At a non-towered airport.
Right. So did I. And I don't know about you, but whenever I grew up, I got, primacy really carries a lot of weight when you're growing up in any kind of hobby or professional curriculum. You get used to what you get used to. So I learned at a non-towered airport. I was fretting over going and talking to a controller and scared to go to a towered airport. But looking back, flying into a towered airport compared to operating in and around a non-towered airport is so much easier. In fact, it's so much safer. And so having this conversation about non-towered airport operations is really, really important for our general aviation audience, I think. And I really appreciate you, putting the time and the effort into doing this, because, this is where we run our greatest risk of having mid-air collisions, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I would agree with a blanket statement that operating in and out of a non-towered field is less safe than a towered field. It certainly can be more orderly than a non-towered field. I won't quarrel with that. I think when everyone is playing by the same rules, that I would probably take respectful exception to that statement. But I will say this, that one of the things that I do as an examiner, when I'm doing a check ride out of a towered field, and this is particularly for private and commercial applicants, I'll put a runway airport diagram in front of them, and I'll draw the left-hand traffic pattern, and I'll say, here's the airplane on downwind, but you're coming in from over here. How are you going to get across the airport and there where you need to be? And I will tell you that I get some pretty creative answers, and some really pretty pictures that they draw on that thing. But I do it for a reason, and it's precisely because oftentimes their instructors haven't spent a lot of time talking to them about non-towered operations, and the few times that they've gone to non-towered fields might be, for example, on a cross-country dual, and they have the instructor there to lean on. I notice it particularly acutely when I ask someone from a towered field to come to West Houston to do their check ride. And I've had some occasions where an applicant has busted a check ride because the situational awareness just isn't there. You know, you might say, well, that's not fair. Okay, but if I'm signing you off for your check ride, I'm saying that you're qualified to fly into Intercontinental Airport, or you're qualified to fly in a dirt strip somebody's farm. And just because you didn't train at a non-towered field doesn't give you special dispensation to fly in there and be dangerous. So is it fair? Yeah, absolutely fair. So if we have any CFIs listening to today, I would really, and especially if they're teaching out of a towered field, I would really respectfully suggest that you spend some quality time with your students, taking them into towered fields, perhaps playing some what if scenarios with them on paper, so that they're well prepared when they're out there flying in the wild west, because there's way more non-towered fields out there than there are towered fields, and sooner or later you're gonna have to fly into one. You better know what you're doing so that you don't become a statistic. And I'm not trying to scare anybody off of flying at a non-towered field. Quite the contrary, I'm quite comfortable flying out of a non-towered field. In a lot of ways, really do prefer it to a towered field. But primacy is a big reason for that too, Jeremy, just because that's the way I learned in it, and it was never a big deal to me.
And to dovetail back to that, you know, having that accurate radio communication, which you and I have discussed many, many times, and you know, we've covered our own little pet peeves that we personally don't like to hear because it bogs down, like 122.8 and 123.0. You know, having good brevity, accuracy, and relevance to relationship with to the not active runway, but the runway in use, or you know, the flow of the traffic at the non-towered airport is important, and maintaining that defensive flying mindset that Rod Machado talks about in the traffic pattern is important as well. But I mean, I want to circle back on that because, you know, I grew up in that non-towered airport environment as well. And I don't want to discourage anybody from operating, but I think that my goal is to obviously make sure that folks keep up their vigilance and their guard when dealing with non-towered airport operations. That's really what I'm trying to drive home there with that statement.
Yeah.
Eric.
Yeah, I think we're kind of, maybe not in so many words, but kind of told that it's easier at the non-towered airports when we're starting out training. So that's supposed to be the easy place, and the tower and the controllers are supposed to be the harder place, but not always the case. I mean, it depends on how busy your non-towered airport is.
And also, and conversely, Eric, it depends on how busy your towered airport is. If you're at a really, really busy reliever airport like David Wayne Hooks here in the Houston area, gosh, you could be number 5 or number 6 for takeoff, and the controllers are really talking fast, and boy, you better be on your A game even as a student. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, because boy, that prepares you for flying into really, really busy airspace. The downside is if you're a student, you're sitting there burning up takt time trying to get in the air. So, you know, it's a two-edged sword, and I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other, but it's different, and some of those differences can be pretty dramatic depending on circumstances.
Yeah, and you and Georgetown and San Marcos are similar here on busy days, and so you probably need a mix of both. I think is the most valuable. I think your phrase "traffic permitting" is a great tip for practice approaches. try to have the presence of mind to use that myself. How do you feel about instrument approaches, either practice ones or really in low conditions, real ones that are non-aligned, like a VOR alpha approach, and discussions around non-towered traffic or operations in a non-towered airport?
Well, that actually brings up a really interesting potential scenario. You're flying a VOR approach that is by definition a circling approach. I don't know how many folks have read Advisory Circular 90-66B, which we've talked about a couple of times earlier during this program, but it very clearly says that circling approaches shall be made to the left. It says it in black and white, circling approaches shall be made to the left. Well, what about an airport that has a right-hand traffic pattern? RP17 or whatever it may be. Boy, now what are you going to do? Advisory Circular says, it says clearly, all circling approaches should be made to the left. And I'll admit it right now, I'm not sure what the answer to that should be.
I
have not. Huh?
I think the regulation would take precedence over the advisory circular.
Well, the regulation says, doesn't it say all turns to the left?
But if you're in an airport that calls for RP for runway 17 or something, what I'm saying, so I think, I don't know, but you're right.
Yeah. And now I freely admit, I'm not really sure what the answer to that question is.
Here's another question that I don't know the answer to either. Justin just put it in here, and this is a question I've asked, but I don't know the answer to this, and maybe you don't know, Pat, and I have a suspicion I might know or have a clue, but why doesn't the FAA use more discrete frequencies at non-towered airports? And I think it's got to do with FCC frequency allocation availability. I mean, but I don't know. Are either of you a ham operator, or perhaps no, or I don't know.
No.
I have no idea.
Your guess is as good as any. Your guess is as good as any.
My guess is that there's no frequency allocation for more frequency. But I agree, because it would be, what's really fun is when you're over the continental United States at 45,000 feet in the jet and punch up 122.8, and all you do is hear a bunch of racket. Now, if you really want to cause some problems, that's when you key up the mic and say, any traffic in the area, please. I'm not saying do that. My goodness, don't ever do that. But
not that you've ever done that, Jeremy, right?
I would never do that. But I'm just saying, that's, imagine what that would stir up. I mean, just.
Well, when I first learned how to fly, just shortly after the Wright brothers soloed, there was only one frequency for Unicom. It was 122.8. Everybody used 122.8, and it wasn't until some years later that 122.9 came into play. 123, 123.05, 122. I think it's 72. There's a handful of them now. There's a list somewhere. I can't remember right offhand where I found it, but there's a list of CTAF frequencies that are kind of in that band at this point, but I don't know where to find that list. Not anymore.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so some questions from the channel here. Discuss when and where you recommend self-announcing while you're inbound to an airport.
Actually, if you look at AIM, it tells you, and I don't have my FAR AIM right in front of me. I think it starts with 10 miles out, and then again at 5 miles out. But I'd have to look at AIM to refresh my memory on that. But it's there clearly in AIM.
Okay. Chairman, let me with another here. How would you suggest managing your spacing between aircraft? So the aircraft in front of you in the traffic pattern.
Don't hit them.
There you go.
Well, I mean,
fish finder, right, Pat?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I got them on the fish finder.
Got them on the box.
Yeah, I got them on the box. Got them on the metal detector. And by the way, I've heard all of that stuff too. So no, don't do that. Just say negative contact if you don't see them.
No joy.
No, God, please, no. My head's going to explode in a minute. Um, um, well, to try to be serious about that. What is the difference in speed in the airplane? If you're flying into the traffic pattern and you're in a Cirrus and there's a 172 that's ahead of you, I mean, you can certainly slow down in the Cirrus and you can get down to 90 knots or so in the Cirrus, and that's not uncomfortable to fly at 90 knots in the Cirrus. But you start getting much slower than that, and the airplane gets a little mushy and a little squishy, and here you've got that 172 flying a short final at 60, 65 knots, and in the POH says 80, so it may necessitate flying a slightly larger traffic pattern. Of course, that can create issues with somebody behind you, even a slower airplane behind you, that other 172 that's in the traffic pattern behind you now, because you had to extend your downwind to accommodate the slower traffic in front of you. Now it means all of a sudden that traffic pattern has gotten out, as I said earlier, to like a 747 size traffic pattern, and you're flying 3-mile finals. So that's a tough one. I mean, it comes down to really common sense and what can you do. It may be best just to circle well away from the airport for do a couple of 360s until it becomes a little more clear of what the picture looks like, and then come on in and land. That's about the best I could offer to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I
You
don't
have
remember.
opportunities to use geometry too, so you could delay your turns on the legs. Don't get too strung out from the airport, but delaying turns buys you space without having to throttle, go to idle and slow down to your mushy.
Well, yeah, you can do that, but remember, if you do some fairly shallow turns, that can also put your downwind at, who knows how fast you're flying. But if you're flying, again, if you're hitting the traffic pattern at 150 knots and you do a 10-degree bank or even a 15-degree bank, I mean, you're going to be a mile and a half or two away from the airport on the downwind leg. And that's got some real downsides to it itself, because best practice, in my opinion, when possible, and I want to put that in bold letters, when possible, best practices, don't put yourself in a position where you can't make the runway if you lose your engine in the traffic pattern. I just think that's a really, really good thing to strive for, if possible. And it's not always possible. Today, during the check ride that I was referring to earlier, we had we had to do a soft field landing, a short field landing, and a normal landing. And because of the traffic that was in the pattern, one of which was this Yahoo and the Malibu, I think the shortest final approach we had was 2 miles. And even at 1,100 feet indicated traffic pattern altitude, when you're 2 miles from the airport, you're not going to make the airport if the engine quits. Mm-hmm. So despite our best efforts to stay in a fairly compact traffic pattern, it was not possible to do. And so that's why I say, when possible, try not to put yourself in a position to that you can't make the runway. I had a Cirrus for a long time, I had a 4-blade prop, and every now and then I would practice the power off 180 to the runway. And flying about a 3/4 mile wide downwind leg, if I pull the throttle or beam the numbers, if I didn't turn to the numbers right then, I would probably not make the runway, depending on the winds. That 4th blade added such drag that the airplane just dropped like a rock, and you add flaps on top of that. And it's almost like like somebody once said, if you fly a Piper Arrow and you want to figure out where you're going to land, just drop a brick out the window, and that's where you're going to end up being. And that particular Cirrus was very much like that. So in a 3-blade prop Cirrus, not such a big deal. And a Mooney, again, your Mooney with the gear up glides pretty good. Mm-hmm. Your what is you got, Luscombe, Jeremy, at 8A?
Yeah.
Glides pretty good.
It does.
But Cessna 172 glides pretty good. but there are other airplanes that don't glide so well. And when possible, try not to put yourself in a position where you can't make the runway if you lose an engine. I was kind of like, I look at it like I'm sitting in front of an FAA administrative law judge, and what am I going to tell them if I've done something that's put me in that chair? So, and so call it defensive flying, if you will. But every decision I make at some level has that underlying premise that if I have to explain my actions, can I justify them? And I would hope that in most cases the answer is yes, I can. But we're all human. Nobody's perfect. I have made some boneheaded mistakes in my flying career, and a couple of times I would say it was just fortune favors the foolish sometimes, and I'm still here to talk about it close to 11,000 hours later and 52 years of flying.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hey, Operation Lights On. Have you heard much about that? I mean, because you don't ever hear that really taught much about anymore. I remember reading about that when I was coming up as a private pilot, reading over it vaguely in an advisory circular. And it's something I really try to enhance upon all of my students. We've gotten away from a lot of aircraft owners, and some of the newer modern aircraft have LED lights. So typically, it's not a big deal to leave your lights on all the time because they're LED, right? They're not going to, they've got a longer lifespan, right? A lot of the incandescent bulbs, they tend to burn out quicker. So aircraft owners, but what's your whole theory on your whole thought process on using landing lights for daytime operations when you're operating in and out of a non-towered airport?
I do it.
Absolutely.
I do it.
Right.
I do it all the time.
Whether it's day, night, on the runway, I'll tell you, whether we're at a non-towered airport or a towered airport, whether I'm in a jet on my professional job, or I'm in a helicopter, or I'm in, a GA airplane. If I'm in a non-towered airport or a towered airport, when I cross a runway, every light on the outside comes on, and I try to make it as bright and as visible as I possibly can. Seconds can save lives.
Yeah, it sure can.
So
you touched on this briefly. I'm going to kind of go on a little closer here, though. So closing your IFR flight plan, what are considerations for doing that, canceling while you're in the air? Clearing 1,000 and low weather, what should you be thinking about?
Okay, so we're on an IFR flight plan. We've been cleared for the approach.
Frequency change approved.
Yeah, no traffic observed between you and the field. Frequency approved. Don't forget to cancel your IFR flight plan with me or on CTAP or on the ground, whatever whatever. Yeah, I know. Heard it a million times. Well, there's a potential catch-22 right there, and you probably will get very quickly what I'm getting at. Let's just say I'm trying to do this all in my head here, but let's just say that that we break out at 1,000 feet, and we cancel, and it just happens to be that at the FAA, there's an FAA guy on the field, and he's chatting you up and said, "So what'd you break out at 1,000 feet? Did you cancel? Yeah. Well, here's your pink slip. Why? 500 foot below the clouds." So Class Echo airspace, the 3152 rules. So, but that's now, and that's absolutely the right thing to do is wait until you're 500 feet below the clouds to do it in Class Echo airspace, so that you're complying with that particular reg. I have heard many times airplanes cancel when I know they've just broken out, because shortly thereafter, when we break out, I know what the altitude is that we broke out at. And the reason that most people tend to do that and get into a hurry canceling before they have, really legal cloud clearance, I think has to do sometimes when, if you know that there's another airplane on the approach, and you've heard ATC say that to the other airplane, I can't give you approach clearance yet because the other guy hadn't canceled. And so you try to be a good Samaritan, good neighbor, and get out of the way. And I get that. But you're putting yourself at potential risk for violation if someone was so inclined to violate you. So I get why people do it. Alternatively, they just want to get out of the system. They're just done. Landing is assured, as you said. Maybe it's visibility is unlimited, but the ceilings are just low, and there's nothing between you and the airport. There's no little wispy clouds. There's nothing that would keep you from making that landing, unless a coyote runs across the runway and you have to go around. That can happen even after you've canceled legally, but I'm just trying to make the point.
So there's more considerations you need to visit before you do that.
Yeah, just know, where's Class Echo airspace out where you are in the middle of nowhere. Class Echo airspace may start at 1,200 feet, depending on the airport. More than likely, it starts at 700 feet. Around most of those, even in the middle of nowhere airports, it's going to start around 700 feet, inside that magenta circle. So again, it's a judgment call at the end of the day, but there is a regulatory requirement to maintain 500 feet below the clouds and horizontally and above and all that kind of stuff. The 3152 rule.
And the purpose of that reg isn't just to, there's a lot of jokes floating around on social media about, is it 450 feet or is it, 550 feet? And to really get like private pilot VFR only guys to understand is the purpose of that regulation is to separate VFR from IFR traffic, is to protect IFR traffic. That's the purpose of that. Just like we're just talking about Angelina County and Temple having Class Echo all the way to the surface. Yeah. An example of that, Temple is the ILS 16. We've got Sore Spot, that glider port that's on the arrival into Temple. So they have to keep the Class Echo all the way down. They protect that airspace. It's about protecting airspace. So.
And something, just because you can fly a mile and clear of clouds in Class Golf airspace doesn't make it safe for you or anybody else. Because maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I got a call from a friend of mine down at LBX. It's Texas Gulf Coast Regional Airport. 7,000 foot long-ish runway. Dow Chemical has one of their corporate aviation offices there. So, 737's flying there periodically. RJ's flying there all the time. And if I remember, I have to go and actually look at the chart, but not very far from that airport, if I remember right, Class Echo starts at 1,200 feet. Well, below 1,200 feet in Class G airspace during the day, it's a mile and clear clouds, right? Right. This is a test, Jeremy. Okay, so I got a call from a friend of mine who had been putting around out there at like 1,100 feet in a J3, no radio, on a day that he probably shouldn't have been up, but it was legal. He had 4 or 5 miles visibility or whatever, if I remember right. So he's legal, but he was flying on the approach end of one of the runways, and a jet came out of the clouds and nearly clobbered him. And he called me in a panic. Did I do anything wrong? Well, legally, no, but he said, well, and I need to understand about, instrument approaches and things like that. I said, well, get your instrument rating. I was joking with him a little bit, but you could try to talk him off the ledge because he was shook, and he should have been. that would have been all over the national news. I mean, and we just don't need that kind of stuff. So,
Right.
I spent some time. I pulled up some instrument approach plates, and we spent some time talking about various fixes and their locations and the altitudes that that are typical at given distances from common distances and altitudes from the average airport and such. And he left that situation, that discussion, with a much better understanding of why just because it's legal doesn't make it smart. And I mean, there's a lot of things in the FAA regs that are illegal but are monumentally stupid if you avail yourself of what you can do.
Exactly. I mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right?
Right. It's like, we talk in the Rusty Pilots and thing about, you walk out to the airplane to fly your flight and you see a flat tire. Well, can you as a certificated pilot change the flat tire? And the answer is absolutely yes. It's unambiguous. In Part 43, Chapter A, Paragraph C, or Appendix A, Paragraph C, says that there's 31 things that you can do, including changing tires and tubes and brakes and lights and all kinds of things that you might think that an A&P would have to do, but that you can legally do and sign off. Just because you can legally do it, though, if you've never changed an airplane tire, it's a split rim. It's got a tube. If that tube is inflated and you try to split that rim, you could potentially end up in the hospital. If you pinch the tube when you're putting that rim back together again, you're going to be changing that tire again sooner than later. So while it's legal, absolutely, is it smart? Not without some training and the proper tools. So but as I said, there's all kinds of things like that in the regs that that make it legal but not necessarily smart.
Well, I think we're through a lot of the good meaty questions. Eric, do you have anything that you'd like to ask or discuss?
Yeah. So scenario is you're flying around in a pretty full pattern, lots of people up in the air, non-towered airport, and someone calls in on a 10-mile final, going to barge into that and scatter everybody to the four corners. Is there a polite way to let them know the traffic patterns got people in it and they might want to reconsider?
Boy, I tell you what, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. If I have in the past said, and this has really been when somebody is reporting 5 miles out, they're going to do a right base into our airport. On our AWAS, it clearly says left-hand traffic. Mm-hmm. And I have more than once told somebody that West Houston traffic is left-hand pattern, and there are a number of airplanes in the pattern. And it's kind of quiet for a second, and then they'll say, "Well, we'll overfly the field and join the downwind or something." It's like, "Oh crap, I'm busted." Mm-hmm. But I think it's a legitimate concern. 10 miles out is not that big a deal. Because there's lots of time, depending on the airplane, for some, if not all of those airplanes to get on the ground. But I don't think it's unreasonable for someone to say nicely, please fly a normal traffic pattern. We've got a pattern full of airplanes. Please join the left downwind, or something along those lines. Nicely. We don't want to start a fight. But at the end of the day, that's really about all you can do. Just because this person is flying a straight-in approach does not automatically give him or her the right of way. Again, 90-66B spells that out along with the rest of the right of way rules. Just because you're coming in straight in and maybe low and maybe slow doesn't necessarily give you the right of way or the right to cut somebody else off in the traffic pattern. So again, that's a tough one.
One final caveat on the traffic pattern entries and all of that sort of stuff. I'm also a helicopter and gyroplane pilot. Someone made a comment earlier, a question earlier about gyroplanes and helicopters, and you know, you can answer this if you want to, but gyroplanes and helicopters and any other traffic like that, as far as, you know, for the good of the audience. You and I are both well aware that it's required, that they are required to avoid the flow of fixed wing traffic.
Correct.
That doesn't necessarily mean that a helicopter has to fly a right-hand traffic pattern. That's a huge misconception.
Yeah, that's correct.
Because avoiding the flow of fixed wing traffic can be flying 500 AGL, you know,
Yeah.
or a different altitude. So
yeah, that is a little bit ambiguous. Well, it's a lot ambiguous, I guess, and a little bit vague. What exactly does it mean, avoiding fixed wing traffic? It means exactly what it says, but there's a lot of different ways you can do that.
Well, it makes it at least restrictive, because as a helicopter pilot, I can fly straight to the pad.
Yeah.
You know, and avoid the flow of fixed wing traffic by coming in 500 feet below airplanes.
Yeah.
So that's why it's written that way, to my guess. And I'm not a lawyer, thank goodness. But
I think that's right, because you have such better, or that's not even the right way to put it. You have more flexibility. You're more maneuverable.
Right, more maneuverability.
Yeah.
Same thing with a gyroplane. Well, Pat, I think we've expired your time. I know that you know, you really enjoy doing these webinars because
they're fun.
And it's a great pleasure to have you on this program. It's a great pleasure to call you my friend. You're definitely a friend of general aviation. Thank you for what you do with AOPA and promoting and protecting general aviation. And I'd like to give you the final word before I close us all out for the evening.
Well, the only thing that I can say, Jeremy, is kind of right back at you. A pleasure to call you a friend. Eric, same with you. You and I've known each other for several years now. But Jeremy, what you do for general aviation, with your passion for safety and whatnot, and putting this together, breaking the chain, I commend you for doing it. I know you don't get paid for it. You do it because you love it, and you do a superb job. And just keep it up, my friend. Look forward to seeing you one of these days, face to face.
I appreciate it. And, you know, while you were giving your presentation, I had to share our video of us flying the float plane around the cannon to Eric so he could take a peek at it. I don't know if he's had a chance to look at that. That was some good times back in the day. So
we had a good time. Yeah, I missed that
airplane. A float plane to go mess around in. So
boy, that's no kidding. I tried to find one around Houston. The only thing I could find, I won't mention the brand, but I didn't particularly like it. So I haven't flown floats for a while.
I haven't either, and it's just a shame that it's not more accessible, because it's a hidden jewel in aviation. It really is.
Yeah.
So, all right, Pat. Well, thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for attending. If you got any questions, comments, send it to flyallamerican@gmail.com. Follow us on social media, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. I didn't put it up here, but you can look up Pat at AOPA. And then I'd like for you all to come back on March the 30th. It's going to be we got a spring break and a busy month coming ahead. So I'm not going to have another program until the end of March. But March 30th, I'm going to welcome my friend from up in North Texas, Dan Milligan from In the Hangar. He's going to come on the program, and we're going to have a conversation about YouTube and Instagram influencer trends and how they can affect and influence aviation safety efforts in a negative or positive manner. So come back to us and on March the 30th, 7:30 p.m. Central. I want to leave everybody with this awesome quote from one of my favorite baseball players of all time, since we're going to that time of the year as spring starts to roll around. You just can't beat the person who doesn't give up. Babe Ruth. That's me. I always like to keep driving on. That's the mentality and approach that I've had with just about everything I've done in life. And I would encourage all of my viewers tonight to consider that as they go forward throughout the rest of their week. From Eric, Pat, and I I'd like to wish you all a pleasant evening. God bless, fly safe, keep learning, never give up on a dream. So long.
Bye.